Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and tonight I'm joined by a close friend of mine, Christian Thuesen. How are you, mate? How's it going?
Hi, mate. No, it's going really well, actually. My club secured place in next year's league yesterday, so top notch.
Yeah, can't beat that. That's going off on a high. Then ending the
Yeah,
season in style. Are you hopeful for the next campaign? Hopefully you'll be able to stay up.
that's all I ask for, really.
Tonight we're also joined by Callum from the Fußball DDR, Twitter page. Callum, how are you, mate? How's it going?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on, mate. It's a pleasure to be here. And like Christian as well, it's been a good weekend for for my club here as well. You know, get a nice win and midway through the season, so it's not too bad. Not too bad for a weekend.
Good. Who is it you support, Callum?
I'm a Derby County fan, unfortunately, for my sins.
For your sins.
So we got a bit. I know how it speeds to the worst club into a top flight this year. So I'm sure we'll touch on a bit of that later, maybe with Tasmania.
How does it feel having your former manager managing in the league above you and not doing too well?
You know what? It's actually not too bad. It's not too bad because we were happy to move on from him
Yeah.
in the time that we needed. And it's always nice to see a former manager leave you and do a bit worse, isn't it? You know, so
Always.
I'm not too bothered by that at all.
Yeah, it was a little bit of me when Brendan Rodgers got sacked. I was like, that's what he deserves, and then we ended up taking him back. So that just goes to show me what I get for doing that and being spiteful. But Callum's inclusion in the podcast tonight and his project Fußball DDR, which focuses on clubs from the former East Germany, means that we are going to Germany and we're going to be talking about Wacker for Berlin, which, although they're a club from West Germany and what was West Germany, they did cross paths with a number of teams from the East. But also, football in the DDR is something that we've wanted to speak about for quite a while. Not mainly because of there's a lot of forgotten clubs as well, but also because it's a really, really interesting period of history. It's a really interesting period of football history as well. There's loads of social and political context to it. It's just a really fascinating period of time. There's lots of information out there about it, and it's just great to talk about it because some of the stuff you might not know, clubs got moved around. As I said, there was lots of politics involved, so it's just a great period of history to look at. So, well, we're going to be talking about Wacker 04 for the sort of first part of this podcast. After that, we'll open the floor and we'll talk about clubs from the former East as well. So, Callum, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your project to start off with?
Yeah, well, I started my Twitter account, or X account, as you might say now. I started that back in a few years ago as a part of my university project now. And what I've been aiming to do is just bring a light to DDR football in the East, because I feel like, we talk about Wacker Berlin and we'll talk about Eastern clubs in general later on, obviously. And I feel like every East club can claim to be a quite forgotten club right now. So it's an area that I feel is very underrepresented on social media and everything, and it's one I wanted to bring light to. It's something I've had a big passion for a few years now. I've gotten as I delve more into research and everything like that. I just you get more and more interested in the clubs and the history behind it as well. And yeah, it's become a big part of what I try to do now, and I'm happy to be able to say I'm be able to visit to Leipzig in a couple of weeks. I can go see my first couple of live Eastern games. I've been to Germany before, but my first actual taste of former Eastern teams in today's Germany will be it's become a big part of my life, and something that I'll be happy to I'm happy to shed a light on and just give some representation into a kind of very forgotten area of German football today.
Yeah, I love how it's just kind of started as a university project and sort of come from there. Those are often the best ones, and it's obviously something you're very passionate about as well. You know, you have to love what you do. So, have you always been interested in German football, and then this just kind of took an additional interest, if you like, or are you quite interested in the DDR and socialism and things like that as well?
Oh, absolutely, I am. I've always been a bit of a lover of history, I could say, from back into yeah, always studied back through school and whatnot. I've always been interested in the kind of, the Soviet kind of bloc countries, and the football, and when you combine the football behind it, and interest with the politics from the Cold War, which has always been an interest for me as well, and then it's just combining it. You combine the two, and then you look to where for me, the home of passion in Europe for football is always in Germany, because you feel, for me, it's what you want as a football fan is to feel that appreciation. You want to feel the atmosphere, and as someone who's been going pretty much my whole life here in England, you feel a bit lost from that. And German football always was that kind of where you feel validated and you feel like you're proper treated as a football fan. You've got power to do that, and then it's just basically it was combining the two kind of passions together, a bit of history to it, and yeah, the love of football, and it was just a no-brainer when as soon as it made sense, kind of thing. It was like, yeah, that's where my passion for football is definitely lines there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I agree with you as well in terms of the history side of things. The Cold War was one of my areas that I kind of studied quite a lot in uni, high school and stuff. Just found it all very, very interesting. And then later on in life, as I got progressively more into football, and had a better appreciation for the politics and social context behind it. When you combine the two, it's fantastic. And Germany is a country that I've always wanted to go to. It's a country I've always wanted to go and watch football in. Hopefully I'll be able to do that sometime next year, maybe at the very least in the future, and be able to do that. My friend went to a Hertha Berlin game last year, and he said, even compared with Scottish games, he goes to Rangers, even compared with up here, it's totally different. It's night and day how you're treated as a fan, and I find that I think it's brilliant. I think it's one of the last bastions, if you like, of fans being treated well, and this kind of era where modern football is really taken over. Christian, what about yourself? Because you mentioned before we came on air that the reason you wanted to come on tonight was because you've got an interest in the DDR and football in the DDR as well. So tell us a little bit about that. Where does that come from?
I think it's sort of a bit related with my fascination for Germany, which to be honest, I think I had it in my entire life. But as a sort of a kid growing up in the 90s, you still have that sort of cultural thing with the war that my grandparents experienced. But that sort of started off a really odd fascination for German culture, and just the thing of wanting to experience this. And ironically, the club I'm going to talk about today started actually with this at my grandfather's old office. He was an architect and did some famous buildings here in Norway. And he had a massive picture of a place in East Germany called Prora, which was a huge concrete slab at a beautiful beach. And this was sort of meant to be Hitler's paradise for vacations. But they just basically ran out of money when the war sort of turned around. So it's a cultural thing. And I remember when I was a youngster also, I went to Germany on Interrail, and I absolutely love it. That country has so much more than what people think. And football-wise, I totally agree with you. Grown up in Norway, lived in England for quite many years. How to do it in Germany is the way.
Nice. Yeah, that's a brilliant answer as well. And I like how you've got the connection with your grandfather there as well. We'll probably touch on that a bit later, and maybe if there's clubs from that area, then we can discuss them too. But of course, as I said earlier on, the club that we're going to be discussing tonight is Wacker 04 Berlin. Quite a difficult club to do any research on. They're very much the epitome of mediocrity in football, and I know that sounds quite bad, and to be fair, there's no getting out of that. It is quite bad. They were the founders of much, but the winners of nothing is probably the best way to put them. And if you guys have looked into them, then I think you would agree as well. Effectively, they were founded in 1904, founded as Rhein-Neckendorfer FC West. And then they merged with Tegeler FC Hohenzollern 1905, and they formed Wacker 04 Tegel. So this is right back at the beginning of their history. They were based in I don't know if it's a suburb or just an area of Berlin called Rhein-Neckendorfer. And they initially played in the Oberliga Berlin Brandenburg, which at the time was the top flight in German football. And I suppose if you go back and look at it, it's interesting because through the different regional leagues in Germany, especially in the early years of German football, there's a lot of teams that we would now associate as big names and teams that didn't exist. There's a lot of mergers in German football. Because it's regional, there's a lot of clubs going defunct and reforming. But there's also a lot of politics and a lot of social aspects at play. Obviously, because of World War II, many clubs were either wiped from the face of the earth because they possibly had Jewish heritage or heritage connected to a number of the other people that were persecuted under the Nazis. Clubs who didn't conform with the regime were eradicated or changed into clubs that supported the regime, etc., etc. We've spoken about this on other episodes. And then, of course, when Germany's partitioned and you had East Germany and West Germany, things completely change. So have you guys found the same? Well, Callum, I'll go to you first. When you're researching the earlier years of German football, it's sort of kind of along those lines. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a very interesting kind of area to research, absolutely, especially in Berlin. We're looking because you can't do the research on East German football without coming across those in the West Berlin as well, and figuring out, especially in today's kind of Germany as well. We're like, I do a lot. The bread and butter for my research at the moment is in is obviously the regional leagues. So the Nordost division at the moment, you still got West Berlin clubs in there. So and you have to, it comes a part of your research anyway. So and that whole period in Berlin, I feel it's a very political time for it. And if you look back into the 60s when when Hertha got relegated from the Bundesliga as it just came in 64, it was vitally important for a Western side from West Berlin to be in the Bundesliga. So, and that's where eventually you get the whole Tasmania awful season in the Bundesliga, the lowest ever points tally. Something I can feel very strongly about, which is not a very good thing to have. I'll tell you that. Oh my God. Oh God, not a good feeling at all that. But yeah, it's a very political area, especially during the Cold War period until the reunification. Yeah, so the whole of West Berlin football was very important to Germany as a whole in that time, and Wacker Berlin were a big part about that as well.
Definitely, and I think what's important to note as well is that, like in many other countries, England and Scotland particularly, football in this period of time really came about because there was a big push for men in particular to be fit, basically. So to be exercising as much as possible, to be playing as many sports as possible. And football clubs in Germany really grew out of other sports clubs. And you still find that it's the case mainly in Germany. Germany's the first example that really comes to my head. But in other European countries as well, the football team is aligned with other sporting divisions. So I think it's Red Star Belgrade maybe have like a basketball team, and we've seen photos and videos of their ultras going to basketball games and stuff and causing riots and things like that. And it was the exact same in Germany. A lot of football teams grew out of these other sports clubs, so they were really sort of like an add-on. And then, like in other countries, football just grew and grew and grew. But at this period of time in Germany, it was still very much a middle-class sport in many ways. It was expected that people who were a little more well-off would be playing it, which is kind of different to a lot of the works teams that were founded in the UK. But it did eventually become the case that it would be the same. But Wacker 04, as far as we are aware, weren't tied to any sports club. But I'm not sure if you've found any other information on that. It's not something that I was able to find out about, or if they still have a sports club or anything like that, actually.
Wacker Berlin, I don't think they was associated with anything, but they did obviously merged together with BFC Alemannia and they added Wacker onto the end of that name as well. But then, as you say, also they reverted back in 2013 to that. So I don't know if there's some kind of connection still there with them, with the fans that still go on. I don't know. But in my research, I've obviously following the lower leagues as well in Berlin is included in that now. I've never come across another Wacker Berlin in a different form yet.
Mm. Yeah, well, again, it's something that we could probably look a little bit more into. We always like delving more into these clubs once we've done the episodes. funnily enough. Maybe not the best thing to do. But we've got our research for these episodes, and sometimes it just depends what's out there and what's not. But we would like to do some more deep dives on some of these clubs. But regardless, through the 1920s, there were a pretty decent mid-table side in the Oberliga. They never won a title, but they were also never relegated. So very much your kind of bread and butter for that league. They stayed in the top flight at the time, and then eventually they joined the Gauliga Berlin-Brandenburg once German football was reorganised when the Third Reich came to power in 1933, but they were immediately relegated. They bounced straight back up, though, only absent for a season, and then they were sent down for the 1939-40 season, and then again got promoted. So they became a bit of a yo-yo club. Obviously, at this time in Germany, other events, shall we say, are happening. There's other context going on in the background, which football, looking back on it, football would have certainly played a second fiddle. And maybe at the beginning in 1933, things for them probably would have been stable, but as the years progressed and you get into the 1940s, then certainly their player base would have probably been eradicated for different reasons. Many of them would have been drafted and sent to fight. But football, in many ways and in many places in Germany, continued through the war because the Third Reich wanted it to seem, like things were continuing as normal and that there wasn't anything going on in the background. So they actually played in the First Division until the end of the war in 1945. And again, it's something that we've come across with other clubs as well who would play through it. Obviously, in other countries, football stopped completely. Football continued in not an unprofessional way, in a non-professional way. So, amateur leagues and just kind of fan leagues and things like that. But through the 1930s, they also made a number of cup appearances, probably not for the right reasons. One of their more prominent ones was a 6-0 defeat by another club linked to a sports club, Tennis Borussia Berlin, who have got quite a cult following these days. Have you ever been to see Tennis Borussia, Callum?
I haven't, no, I haven't. But I've come across obviously a lot of them with their time in the regional leagues as well. I've actually bought during COVID. They had a couple of when they was doing this virtual tickets for the games and whatnot. I bought myself a couple of them, but never actually been across the Monsen Stadion. I've been past it on the way to the Olympic Stadium in Berlin, but that's as close as I can get to them so far.
What about yourself, Christian? You ever been to see Tennis Borussia?
No, I haven't, but I really would like to go with them. I had a friend who lived in Berlin, and he went to see them quite often actually. And he told me that they have a really odd group of fans. For instance, they are against flares, which is quite normal in Europe, not so much in the UK on the stands. And they are a bit of an odd club. I think they had also run to try to become a top club, like type in the 90s. But it's a bit of a character club, and I believe they are not far out on the left, but pretty much on the left. For political wise, in Berlin, it's oh god, what are they called? In Regionalliga. Now it's I have to cheat a bit on Google. Sorry.
Christian doing his research. That's okay. I do it all the time. Need to do these things. So, is this a club that you're thinking of from Berlin who are politically on the left that are quite prominent?
Yes.
Yeah.
No. It's oh, it's standing still for me now. Give me a few minutes, guys, and I'll get back to it.
No problem. We'll come back to you. See if you've got that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they were beaten 6-0 by Tennis Borussia in the final of the Berliner Landespokal in 1931. And they made 3 other appearances in the Schammerspokal as well, which is the predecessor to the DFB Pokal Cup today. And at the end of the war, Wacker resumed First Division play in the Oberliga Berlin. They had a sort of name change at this point. They initially played as SG Reichendorf West, but then they were sent down after the last place finish in 1956. So they finished rock bottom and they were relegated. They came back up to the Oberliga a season later and they stayed there until 1963 when, of course, the Bundesliga was formed, which was at the time the newest professional league in Germany. Wacker would play second-tier football in the Regional League of Berlin and the 2 Bundesliga Nord, where they performed quite well on the field despite their limited resources by all accounts. They didn't have a huge budget, either transfers or in wages. They didn't even have a huge fan base either, really, but they managed to kind of perform out with their means, which is always quite nice to see. During the 70s, the club earned 3 second and 1 first place finish in the regional Liga. And then they managed to get to the 2 Bundesliga, which was quite impressive. But their experience wasn't as good. It was actually pretty difficult. And it led to the relegation to the Amateur League of Berlin, which was tier 3 at the time in 1977. So they spent one more season in the 2 Bundesliga Nord. They slipped to eventually play in the 3rd and 4th tiers, where they basically toiled for about a decade and a half, and then they went bankrupt in 1994. And at the time, they were playing in the Verbandsliga Berlin. And then after that, some of its members went on to join BFC Alemannia 90, which resulted in the club changing their name to BFC Alemannia 90 Wacker, which was never really an official name, so something that was just kind of colloquial, I guess. And was eventually, the club reverted back to its name in 2013. But that's essentially the story of Wacker 04 Berlin and everything that we know about them. So very much a club which existed for a period of time and then just ceased to exist. We found that with quite a lot of clubs. Normally there's something else to attach to them in terms of how they were founded, whether they were a works team, formed by pioneers from other countries, if you like. But for Wacker 04 Berlin, it is literally the case that the information we have here, they were founded in 1904. They played in top tier football in the early days of German football, and then they just slowly started slipping down the divisions until they eventually went defunct. But the interesting thing about Wacker 04 Berlin is that they were actually the founding members of quite a few leagues. Some of the short-lived leagues that existed in Germany kind of in the interwar years, and then post-war during partition. But importantly, they were a founding member of the 2 Bundesliga in 1974, but then eventually dropped out of professional football in 1979. So is this a case with quite a lot of early clubs in Germany, Callum, where you found that they're the founders of leagues, but they no longer exist, or they just ended up slipping into mediocrity? Because it's something that we see quite a lot of over here as well, that a lot of the early success stories, if you like, are no longer with us.
Absolutely. In the case of especially former GDR sides, we look into those, how, like, obviously from a personal point of view, to look at how the reunification handled to East German sides. You look, and only 5 teams from the former East, we're not including obviously that Red Bull kind of franchise in Leipzig, but only 5 teams who actually played in the former GDR actually have made it to the Bundesliga, and 2 of them were after the reunification, when it was Dresden and Hansa Rostock got given the spots, and the rest of the clubs are put in the 2nd tier and the 3rd tier, or even lower, and it's so common to see all the clubs go down. You could only really, myself, I could say, there's only really been Union and possibly Cottbus, I would say, maybe, who's had some good successes since, or had better time of it in the United Germany than in the GDR period. So you can certainly make a case for that. But yeah, absolutely. And on that end of the Wacker period as well, it's quite interesting to find out in my research as well, looking at them for that. They were obviously, with the reunification, they were put into the Oberliga Nord, the 3rd tier, I think it was then. And they got put in with teams like BSC Dynamo back then, and as they in their first kind of reunification kind of season. So they certainly spanned a lot of periods of time, and into clubs like that. And they even held Dynamo, who won that. I think they won that league in that year as well. They held them to a draw as well. They play teams like Vorwärts Frankfurt, who were 6-time GDR winners, who were a very, very interesting club. And there was I think called Victoria at the time then after as well. They even held them to a draw, but then they beat Stahlweisen Hutenhat. I think if I could pronounce that. Sorry, any Germans listening, my pronunciation's not great. But yeah, they even managed to beat them that year, and Stahl that year even played in Europe. In that season, so they had a really interesting kind of end to that. But yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And as we said, there was a huge disparity between teams from the former East and teams from the West as well. So maybe they benefited from that, maybe they didn't. So they are a really, really interesting club. It's just a shame that we don't have a huge amount of information on them. But as you said through your research, you found that they did cross paths with a lot of teams from the former East after reunification, and that's something that we're definitely going to touch on when we come on to it. Christian, did you manage to find the club that you were looking for?
Yes, I did. It's Babelsberg. They are in the Regionalliga, which is the fourth tier. And when I'm listening here and I'm looking on the table, I'm just like, oh yeah, Koppes, old DDR giants, BFC Dynamo, old GDR giants, Erfurt, old giants, Carl Zeiss Jena, old giants, Chemie Leipzig, old giants, Luk Leipzig, old giants, Chemnitz, formerly known as FC Karl Marxstadt, I believe.
Yeah.
Zwickau, old giants from the east. You could see they are really sort of limping behind. It's and I think also it's a really interesting thing to see that how all the clubs from the east must have started like 10 paces behind everyone from the west, and that's before the money when this reunification happened. I was in the German Football Museum this summer.
Nice.
And I thought it was a really interesting exhibition, but I couldn't help notice that DDR had their own little thing, and that was sort of it. I can't help think that there's some culture stuck in the walls here, that they are a bit the annoying little brother, but we took them on sort of.
I think you're on the right track there. Now, one of the books that we spoke about off air was by Kit Holden Scheiss, We're Going Up, which focuses on the story of Union Berlin. They were very much a club from the former East, and as Callum mentioned, are probably one of two, maybe three success stories of clubs from the former East. And he kind of said the same. There's very much this cultural thing that still lingers, particularly with people who grew up and lived during partition, if that's what you want to call it. There's still a bit of cultural superiority, and of course, this is speaking as someone who isn't German. Obviously, want to put that out there. The listeners will probably know that anyway. But there's a bit of a cultural superiority, and I think that can translate into football as well. What he mentioned as well, and what he brought into it, was that a lot of areas from the former East are more likely to be impoverished. They're more likely to have less job opportunities for young people. They're areas where far right sentiment is more prominent and where you can find it a lot more. It's really, really interesting to look into all these different things. And of course, when we're talking about football and clubs and the fans, especially in Germany, who are passionate, and teams that are lower down the leagues in Germany and the regional leagues and things like that, their attendances will be crazy compared to a lot of the lower league teams here in Scotland. Just for a comparison, the fans are very, very passionate, and we know that football clubs are vehicles for these expressions of identity and other things to come out. But you obviously mentioned BFC Dynamo there. Well, both of you mentioned them at some point. Am I right in saying that they would become Dynamo Dresden? Am I right in saying that? Or were they?
No.
Okay.
No. The story there is in DDR they just moved teams around. So basically, Dynamo Dresden was moved to Berlin to become Berlin, Dynamo Berlin. However, the youth department was allowed to keep on as Dynamo Dresden, and that was the team that later played their way up and is the club that's Dynamo today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Dynamo Dresden, they was allowed because obviously both Dynamos, BSC Dynamo was infamously, obviously had favoritism with the Stasi. Eric Milka, the head of the Stasi, was
their biggest fan.
Dynamo. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and then but Dynamo Dresden, they was controlled by the Volkspolizei. So they also had a lot of power and a lot of supporters, and that's how they was allowed to continue on as a club down in Dresden as well. But yeah, so that's where the rivalries kind of stem from, especially during GDR times, because they're one of the two most successful clubs, obviously, in the country at the time.
Mm. Yeah, and it's obviously very, very interesting seeing how these clubs, as Christian said, went from being former giants to now lagging behind, and that was before this era where money really dominates the game and things like that. And it's all really been quite fascinating. I mean, obviously, I want to dig more into Wacker for Berlin and find out more about them. Obviously, Callum, you've researched some of their fixtures with former teams from the East, but we'll start off with yourself, Callum. Have you come across any other clubs from the DDR which are now defunct? I mean, there must be quite a few, surely.
Ooh. There is loads of clubs you could choose. I think I touched on earlier. You can make a case for every single club in the former East for it. But to be honest, they can't surely be much bigger clubs than maybe obviously Vorwärts Frankfurt, who are now known as Erste FC Frankfurt. They was the club in the GDR time. They was originally based in Leipzig, but then they got moved in the 50s to Berlin because there was the army club. So you had the rivalry between Dynamo Berlin of the Stasi and then the army club of Vorwärts Berlin. They became. They won 6 titles, I believe, up until '69, I think, with all the changeover in 1966 of becoming football clubs and professionalizing kind of most of the teams. So Vorwärts Berlin, they had to move out to Frankfurt, a tiny kind of town village, town city type on the Polish border. But they had some success. There was a regular outfit in the DDR Oberliga. And nowadays they're playing their trade into the 6th-tier Brandenburg Liga. They've been a bit up and down really between the 5th, 6th tiers in the last few years. They got relegated last year from the Oberliga Nord when they had a really decent start and went on a horrendous run of form, and they ended up just getting relegated. But then this year, I think they're topping the Brandenburg Liga straight away. So they can't be. You can make a case for so many clubs on there. If you form a GDR like Stahl Brandenburg, you could say Stahl Riesa or any of the other clubs like that. You could say, but I don't think they can't be much bigger than Frankfurt. To be honest with you.
Yeah, there's been a lot of name changes, mergers, clubs being moved, obviously, and clubs just ceasing to exist. You've touched on it as well. There were some clubs, and you'll find this with a lot of clubs and nations that were part of the Soviet bloc. You know, you had clubs favoured by the Stasi, you had clubs which were the army team, clubs which were the police team, clubs which came from workers' team, obviously. Eintracht, teams with Eintracht in the name, are clubs that were railway workers, I think I'm right in saying. So you've got all of these different elements of society which have their representative team. And obviously, as you'd probably have guessed it, the clubs that were supported by the police and the secret police and the military and the government thereby are the clubs which are going to have more of the resources, if you like, and clubs that are going to be favoured. So there's all these different aspects and all these different dynamics at play which make it all really, really fascinating. And of course, when that all collapses and West Germany takes over effectively, then there's a lot of changes that a lot of clubs just couldn't quite cope with. And Christian, what was the club that you had in mind? Because you mentioned that you actually had a club that you wanted to speak about. So why don't you go ahead and tell us about them?
Yeah, this was a club that I accidentally tripped over when I was 19 years old and was going to go on Interrail in Germany.
When was that? That must have been in the 50s, 60s?
Yeah. I think because I have my travel letter up here. I can't flip and remember. I'm 1986, so 04, 05. But yeah, anyway, I took the train down to Germany and I was going to explore part of that fascination I had for the history part and the World War II part. So I went up to this place called Prora, this holiday colony outside a town called Stralsund, by the sea. And this island is amazing, guys. Go there. really, it's one of the coolest places I've been in my life. Quiet, cheap, great beaches, but it's a bit windy. But to explore this, I lived in a city called Stralsund, I said, and as the youngster on trip, I went to the first bar, and there I met the guy who ran it, a guy called Ingo, and he started talking, and I got a bit German from school, so but he found out that I like football, so he said, "Oh, you have to come to the game tonight." And I was like, "Sure, why not?" So basically, his daughter took me to the game, to Stadion der Freundschaft, to see a club called Pommern Stralsund. But in good DDR spirit, this club has changed names quite sometimes. And I'm going to try to do this in a simple way. But it's founded in 1952, a bit north of Stralsund, in a place called Parov. This was where the local Coast Guard had base. So this was basically the Coast Guard team. And as we heard a bit about in DDR, they move clubs around like drunk sailors. And the plan was to get an Oberliga team for Rostock, but because the local teams didn't manage it. So this club was moved to Rostock in 1954 and was given the name Armeesport Forfärts Rostock. But they did not make the cut to the Oberliga. They were a level 2 club. But when the club Empor Lautern got promoted in 1965, this is not far from the Czech border, I believe. So, and it's a really fascinating story about this. And they were basically just told to get on the bus, and they were moved to Rostock overnight. And I mean, this was basically a football club. All the coaches, family, kids, get on the bus, move, and they became Hansa Rostock. So there was too many clubs in Rostock. So Forfärt was moved back to Stralsund in 1967 and was given the name ASG Forfärt Stralsund. And ironically, in their absence, and a club had sort of played themselves up a bit, but in good DDR spirit, this is the club we're going for now. You boys aren't playing for the local rival BlueSky Motor anymore. You now play for Forfärts. So the time flies by. They have 2 seasons in the Oberliga, actually, in 1974 and 1971. Sorry, but they never really make anything big out of it. In 1989, Forfärts gets they joined forces with the local club Motor Stralsund, and in 1990, with the fall of the wall, Motor Stralsund changes its name to get rid of the DDR stamp, as many clubs do. Sadly, if you ask me, they've changed name to TSV 1868 Stralsund, 1860 Stralsund. But again, they changed name in good DDR story. To FC Pommern Stralsund, and today 1860 Stralsund again. This is DDR in a nutshell.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's a really good microcosm into a lot of these clubs, is that they exist for so long, their team gets moved, their players get moved, their fans are having to move about. They change their names so many times, and that's before reunification. And then when reunification happens, it's just repeating the same cycle. And it's no wonder that because of that, a lot of these clubs ended up having to fold, because you're playing around so much with identity, and identity in football is something that obviously our listeners will know I'm quite big on when you're discussing heritage and the kind of intangibles of that. And when you play around with that, then you run the risk of your club falling out of existence forever, as we've seen so many times. Another club that you have both mentioned from the former East, Chemie Leipzig as well. Again, another club that we've probably seen a lot of videos of and things recently. I think recently they played a game against RB, did they not, in the cup? Or I think I'm maybe getting that mixed up with the other club from Salzburg, actually. Sorry, but obviously, Kimi fans are very, 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 very to the point with the criticism of Red Bull. Who wouldn't? To be fair, and we see a lot of their kind of fan action and their ultras producing banners. Have either of you ever been to see Kimi before? Callum, will start with yourself.
I haven't, but there might be a chance it might be in the next couple of weeks. As when I'll be in Leipzig, definitely go visit the stadiums. Because when I'm there, they're going to be playing the derby against Lock when I'm there. So it'd be absolutely stunning to be able to go. But I'm very aware there's only about 5,000 allowed in for safety grounds, and I wouldn't want to take a ticket from a real fan going to that game. So I might just hop across Saxony to Dresden on that day. But certainly when I'm going to be there, I'll visit the stadium and for that matter, the one in Impropstade in Leipzig as well to see Locks as well. But yeah, they're very very historic club. They've got very good ties to Eintracht Frankfurt. If anyone's been following them or what I've been putting out, tweeting the last few weeks, they played a friendly against Eintracht about a month ago now, I believe. And the scenes they have at the stadium, they've got such a loyal fan base and whatnot, and they're a club again. Both Leipzig clubs have had such a turbulent kind of period after reunification. Chemie, I think if I'm right in saying Chemie Leipzig merged with Chemie Bollen in the 90s. And then that became Saxon Leipzig, which was the main club to come out of DDR period. And then they went bust, I believe, and fans restarted Chemie Leipzig again. But that just shows you the determination of all the fans. They just keep the club going, and it's still one of the best supported clubs in the former East now. And certainly bigger than that Red Bull kind of franchise as well, because there's only two clubs in Leipzig for me, and that's not including the Red Bull team.
Absolutely, I think that's a sentiment that can be echoed by a lot of our listeners. Hopefully, we've talked about the Red Bull teams and other such groups and things, and we're totally against them. It's just wrong in every sense of the word, especially whereas football is concerned. But I mean, if you were able to go to the derby, then that would be an absolutely fantastic experience. I can imagine that'd be a bit of a bucket list thing as well, and especially because of your project, it'd be something that's a nice full circle moment almost, just kind of tying everything up. But one thing that I did want to ask you actually is, just in your research from former clubs in the DDR, what are some of the best stories that you've come across? I suppose is something that I wanted to ask. Obviously you have the success stories from Union Berlin. They're really, really sort of climbing the ladder at the moment, and that's not been without its sacrifice. But what are some of the other stories from other clubs? Some of the things that some of our listeners might not know about.
There's so many interesting stories you can choose from. Just try and get one to pop into my head, but from after reunification, there hasn't really been much good feel stories apart from obviously what people might forget. Cottbus made a DFB Pokal final as well. Union made one, got into Europe as a second division club in the early noughties. If they both those sides had some brilliant runs. Cottbus was unfortunate enough not to get into Europe that time, because I think the team they played, I can't remember who they played now. But they didn't get into Europe with it. But Union did, and as they was in the third division when they made the final. And then the next year they was playing Europe as a second tier side, and that was the first time a team from the former East had participated in UEFA competition. Competitive, because Hansa Rostock did qualify for the Intertoto Cup in the 90s, but can't really count that, really, to be honest. But the proper one was Union back then, and they're the only side, Union, especially with all their rise up through these last few years. They're the only sides who have made European football, and back in the Eastern times, I think it got to highest sixth in UEFA ranking, the DDR-Oberliga maybe. It got quite reasonably standard for it. And then Magdeburg won the Cup Winners' Cup back in the 70s. And then we've got a couple of finalists with Jena and Leipzig made a final. And there's some really interesting stories if you just delve in and follow some. Yeah, I like what you got there, Christian.
Yeah, Magdeburg.
Magdeburg, yes, yes.
That's so obviously for our listeners who very obviously can't see what Christian's holding.
Yeah.
Is that a Magdeburg pennant that you've got there, Christian?
Yeah, it is. My team has played against Magdeburg.
Nice.
I actually have a ticket for the game. 70th September 1980. Unused ticket for the game.
So was that a friendly game? Was it in European competition or?
No, this is after Moss. We won the cup and we got qualified for that. So that's my club has been in Europe 3 times. It's Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, and FC Magdeburg. And the coolest one of them is the FC Magdeburg, if you ask me.
Definitely no. I was about to say it's a star-studded cast of characters there. Very
unfortunate there for
sure. Yeah, very, very unfortunate that your kind of first maiden ventures into Europe, if you like, and you get Bayern Munich and Real Madrid, and of course Magdeburg as well. Yeah, absolutely nuts. A shame though.
Yeah. But it's I think also that's sort of a bit where I have some odd fascination for these German teams with. I've heard some stories about the bus ride from the Moss players back then, with driving a bus in DDR with the Stasi Trabant behind them, and it's just the whole place was just deeply, deeply odd.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, one of my tutors in university, a gentleman called Holger Nering, he's quite eccentric, shall we say. That's probably a good word to describe him. But he was taking our class on Cold War history, and the first story he told us was he grew up in the East, and he and his friends used to risk, or he knew someone who used to risk crossing the wall so that they could bring back Levi jeans, because the jeans that they had in the East were just such terrible quality. And he said when the wall fell, he remembers one of the first things happening to him was he heard Christina Aguilera for the first time and he was blown away. And it's just like these wild tales that you hear, and it's like a completely different reality, but people don't realize is that's what people were living under. I mean, in Kit Holden's book that we've mentioned, he's got some accounts from older fans of Union Berlin, and they're talking about being chased by the Stasi, and their club culture is one that's always been very rooted in not any political ideology, but always just being of their own making, if you will, and of their own kind, where they don't care much for authority. They're not exactly anti-establishment, but they don't care much for them either. They just like to be left alone to do their own thing, and I think that's quite admirable as well. They just like going to games. They like drinking beer. They like duking through the forest, and they've got their scraps with the rival ultras as well. But it really puts into perspective how football was played and how fans engaged with football during these different regimes. I mean, there's obviously been some horror stories. Especially if you look at the former Yugoslav as well, and when the civil war was beginning to take root, there's some absolutely horrible tales about what happened to people during that as well. And in the DDR, although it wasn't on such a scale as the Yugoslav war, there was probably some similar stories as well that you've probably come across like that as well, Callum, where football is concerned. But of course, as we said, some clubs were effectively arms of the state as well in that regard. So a lot of the fans would have probably, by going to the games, ultimately ended up being oppressed through that as well.
They would have been, to be fair, back then. And there was, I think I read a stat somewhere. There was about what I was one in 5 or something, 1 in 10, something quite sure that was informal Stasi informants as well back then. So you run a real risk if you want to say anything against the regime. So the oppression was there, and especially when that's why BSC Dynamo is firmly hated by every single club, you could say, in the GDR near enough, apart from, I think now I think there's some small affinity with Magdeburg, some ultras group there. I think there's something small between them, but everyone else is firmly against them. I think I won't quote me on that, but I think that might be true. But yeah, the Union were the civilian club. They were the club of owned by the FD GB. There was the trade union, the only trade union allowed in the former East. So they represented the people. So Union became a place where, and I've seen it many a time written down or in documentaries. They became a place to you can vent yourself because the people there are like-minded like you. They're just the people who just want to go and watch the football. Um, so you can see how this huge rivalry formed with the kind of like establishment of BSC Dynamo, all for that, and then against the establishment at Union Berlin. So the East Berlin derby for me, and it's not been played for obviously a very long time, but that would be, yeah, we've seen how good Hertha Union's getting, but I think if you look between that rivalry and that kind of anger or however the frustration from the past, especially amongst the older fans, it definitely the BFC Union, it still exists to this day.
I think it's quite interesting as well that you mentioned the resentment there, because one thing that Kit Holden touches on is, of course, back then you would have had this resentment between Union and Dinamo. It's because one club is effectively the establishment club and one club is the club of the people, if you would like. And there's going to be that resentment, there's going to be this rivalry. But what he said is that after reunification, now that we're about coming up to 3 decades roughly, or we're past 3 decades now, with a lot of areas of former East Berlin basically becoming gentrified, you've got a lot more people from, I don't want to say Western backgrounds because that's probably not entirely correct, but you've got a lot of people who were brought up in the former West, maybe, who are now moving into East Berlin, and the attitudes are kind of changing. And whether or not it's intentional, we can never really say. And I wouldn't want to comment on that personally, just because I'm not German. I don't know any people from either area, but it does indirectly or unintentionally lead to a bit of erasure as well. And I think that's quite important to mention. And one thing that they mentioned is that with Union Berlin's rise, there's kind of came this trend of fans starting to go into them because they're viewed as like the kind of outsider club. They're like the hipster club, if you want to say. So people that were possibly from West Berlin or wherever from the former East now go and see Union, and the opinions and the stands are changing because there's now conflicts internally between the fans. So I think that's quite an interesting thing as well. I'm not entirely sure if you'd see that in other cities in the East, mainly in the former East, sorry, mainly because, obviously Berlin was divided basically 50-50, more or less. So I'm not entirely sure if that's something that's unique to Berlin, but I think it's quite an interesting dynamic to take into consideration as well, that football clubs, like other aspects of life, can be gentrified as well. And perhaps clubs from the former East are maybe feeling that. Obviously, if there's already this sort of perception that they're viewed as outsiders anyway, and that they've got this kind of outsider mentality when they're playing games, and then that's something maybe to at the very least keep an eye on.
It definitely is, I feel, because especially despite all the rivalry, I feel like there's definitely a shared kind of feeling amongst most of the GDR clubs, or former GDR clubs, sorry, that there is this, they've been through obviously the same pain after unification. They've been through the same similar things, and it was a real problem in the 90s how it wasn't a reunification as such. It was more of an absorption. I think I've seen before. It was nothing close to reunifying. With
Yep.
Obviously it was unfair on coming for the GDR clubs coming in from having to change to a new system of a free market where you have to make the money. This is how football was worked. It was sponsorships and things like that. They had never had to do this ever before. So the clubs, and they had all this money coming in through revenue and the TV and everything like that. And they didn't really, it was mismanaged, but they didn't really know how to handle it at all with all this incoming money. And then with the competitiveness from the teams from the West, you got people like the Leverkusen manager, director at the time, Rainer Kalmund. He was, he come and pinched Andreas Tom from BSC Dynamo, the best player in the Oberliga that season. Within a month of the wall coming down, he's already signed for Leverkusen it was announced, and then Ulf Kirsten, he left Dresden as well for follow similar path. So all the players were plucked away from the clubs, and the East, they didn't get the money they deserved, and they didn't invest it wisely enough, or it was just so many catastrophic failures on their part for why the clubs failed after unification.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. There was a lot of opportunism. I think people like the Leverkusen director that you mentioned just waiting to snap up the best talent. And I don't think this is just a case for football. I think this is a case for reunification as a whole. Is that the West basically said, okay, you're back in, deal with it. And they didn't really give them much support, because a lot of those clubs, as you mentioned, they wouldn't have had the infrastructure to even compete with the West German clubs at that level. A lot of them might not have even have had the knowledge base to kind of grow and adapt the clubs for that. So it was a huge disparity at the time. And to be fair, as we've said, there's only really 2 or 3 success stories now, so it's still something that's massive. And I think it's quite understandable that a lot of people and a lot of clubs from the former East might view themselves as being outsiders and have that kind of siege mentality around them, Certainly something that culturally and in the back of a lot of people's minds is maybe a bit of an elephant in the room. But obviously, you mentioned you're going to be going to Leipzig in the next few weeks or so, and hopefully you get to go to the Kimi game and at least see the stadium. I think that would be absolutely amazing. Have you been to Germany before? Have you been to many former Eastern teams or many matches at all when you've been over?
I've only managed to be able into Germany once, and that kind of like kick-started my. Obviously, always love German football, but then you actually go over and see it first time. And I went and actually saw Hertha Berlin in the Olympic Stadium back in 2019. I believe it was a 3-0 home loss to Wolfsburg. So it wasn't. It was a nice, interesting to see, but you see the fans when they're 3-0 down like that, and the atmosphere is still given, and that's what completely won me over. And that's what kind of really started to kind of like to get involved and looking at the East as well, because obviously seeing the disparity when I was in Berlin, looking like we flew into Schönefeld airport at the time, which is a former Eastern airport, and you see the difference between East and West is still very much there to go and see. And then obviously you delve more into see the clubs and whatnot in there, because we all knew Union were the club from the East, but what you don't realize is Union weren't one of the big clubs really. They was allowed to become one of the 10 or 11 football clubs in 1966, but they were never really successful. They won 1 cup and was a yo-yo club between the top and the DDR-Liga. So you don't get to research that. You don't get to know about BSC Dynamo, who won obviously all those titles controversially. And so I'm going to be very interested to go and see, especially because I've done Berlin. I will definitely be back there again to see BSC at least, and hopefully Union if possible to get a ticket. But obviously, don't want to take tickets off real fans myself, so it'd be one of them. But definitely when I get down to Saxony, see the stadiums at least. I'm gonna go see. Probably haven't mentioned yet actually. Hallischer FC on the Saturday when I'm down there. They got Saarbrücken in a difficult relegations kind of scrap at the moment for them down there. So it'd be interesting to see a new city like that. And then I'll be staying in Leipzig, seeing around there, and then possibly get across to Dresden on the Sunday if I can't get to the derby.
Nice. No, it's a brilliant trip. That sounds like you've got planned, man. That's amazing. So obviously, never mentioned it before and probably never will again. Scotland qualified for another European tournament, another international tournament, second, well, not second on the bounce actually, second in a few years and second in my lifetime, which is nuts. So me and my friends are all going to be traveling over to Germany next year, which is going to be amazing. Can't wait for that. It's just a shame that obviously there's not going to be any league football on at the time, because we would have liked to see some of that while we were there. But I think just it's going to be going to a new country. Hopefully, with any luck, we'll get some tickets for it. We've all went into the ballots, so we'll see how that goes. And yeah, really, really excited to go. I've never been to Germany before, and you always get that new country excitement, but when there's football involved as well, it just brings a completely different element to it. What about yourself, Christian? You must have been to quite a few games in Germany yourself. I know you would have been quite young at the time. Did you ever go to the DDR at any point?
No, I didn't. But I had a holiday with my dad. I believe it was 97 or 98, car holiday in Germany, and we went to the DDR. And I remember I just thought it was really, really grey, not much color on just on the buildings. A bit boring architecture. It sort of this is boring for a kid, if you know. It wasn't much anything exciting to see. But just while you talk about BFC Dynamo, they now actually play in a really cool stadium. They play in Sportforum Hohenschönhausen, and that's a ground I think you should just go into Google and have a look on it. It looks absolutely cracking ground to see a game and have a few beers on. And BFC got fans. And if you're a bit lucky, Rory, as you're going to Germany next summer, and me as Norwegian have to stay at home, you might actually get some Regionalliga. And to be honest, and that's the fourth tier. Have a look at it. Go. It's one of these leagues that you can get some really, really interesting clubs that drew quite a lot, and clubs that drew 200-300. But the football isn't bad neither.
Yeah, no, it's something that I've always wanted to try. So, I mean, to be honest, I only really started going to lower league in Scotland. Must have been about 4 years ago, properly. I only started going to non-league really this year, to be honest. But lower league and non-league in other countries is something that's been on my bucket list to do for a very, very long time. Just with circumstances, it's not been possible. But moving forward, whenever I'm on holiday, it's something that I'd love to do is just dart around football games and go and just soak it all in, to be honest, because it's completely different to how we have it over here. And it's just something that I'd want to experience. And to be fair, I would love to go to an Union Berlin game, but as Callum said, I would feel, I'd feel quite bad about taking tickets from an actual supporter. Obviously, from what we've spoken about from Kit Holdensburg as well, that would probably be, probably frowned upon a little bit. But I mean, there's quite a few clubs that I'd quite like to go and see as well.
The thing with I got a friend who's married with a lady from East Germany, and he's a member in him and his wife is a member in Union Berlin, and season ticket holder for many years. And he sort of said that to me, that the thing is, what they don't like is people paying overpriced for it.
Sure.
If you basically pay the same price, you're much more welcome than people on the black market who just today. I mean, I work with a guy who paid €250 for a ticket for Borussia Dortmund, and if you ask me, that's flipping much. That's two season tickets in my club for one game. And I think that's the thing also with a lot of German fans. They're not necessarily against the tourist as long as you behave and pay the flat rate. Don't overpay for it.
Yeah, and it's a huge issue as well, up here especially. So tickets most in demand is probably if there's an Old Firm Scottish Cup final, right? Because they're the big events of the season. The Scottish Cup finals, the very last fixture of the calendar, supposed to be anyway. And if it's an Old Firm final, then it's a huge event on the schedule. And I've seen tickets for the Celtic end anyway going for, I think the highest that I've seen before was about £370, when normally it's about 50. And I don't know, I'm in two minds about it, because one part of me is like, well, if you want to pay that amount of money to go to a football game, then fair play. But then I'm like, what are you doing? Like, it's stupid money. You should not be doing that.
Yeah.
But also, and that this is a lot of people don't like it when I say this, but it's true, to be honest. A lot of people go to these things because it's basically a big piss up as well.
Yeah.
So part of me is like, well, someone who goes to the games more could probably have went to that. Not that I'm against people who've never been to a game before or that going. Just it's one of these things. So it's quite good that obviously German teams have this in place. To cap ticket prices, is it still the case that it's about €20 to go to a Bundesliga game?
I think it's a bit up and down, but I think the campaign says 20 is plenty.
20 is plenty. Okay, sorry,
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of blanket across the.
Yeah, I think I paid a bit more when I went to see HSV, which was the last big game I went to Germany. But yeah, it's as a fan and also as one sort of fighting for the fans' rights here, I think it's quite an important fight to take, actually. To quote the song, if you tolerate this, then your children will be next.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's a very important point, that, because obviously I know it'd be quite bad up in Scotland, obviously worry with Celtic and Rangers, but here in England it's unbearable at times, and I'm not happy about my club slipping to the third tier, but it comes with its own benefits. With the modernisation, can stay away for a little bit longer. Our ticket prices are still not great in League One. We're still paying for some away clubs that we have to go to around the high 20s in League One, which is it doesn't sound about right, but that's what they do. But it's the fact, it's not just that, it's like the kickoff times that we have, and it's great to have, like we mentioned about, it's great to have tourists know how good the game can be and see all this, but it takes away that feeling from it doesn't feel like your club, it doesn't feel like a community club when it goes to that. It doesn't feel like your club represents it becomes a tourist attraction. It becomes an event you go to, and whereas it should be just, this is your club, this is where you go to, this is what you do. It's not an event to go to. We go to support our club, and that's what gets lost here, especially in England. And it's why I look to Germany a lot more about the fan culture and everything, because England, we're the worst for it here. We really are, and it spills down to the Championship and even the League One in some parts. I still feel that bit of disconnect even from there, but it's not as bad as it can be.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's so, I mean, when I go to Celtic Park, I've got a season ticket, thankfully, so the price kind of takes care of itself kind of earlier on in the season. But it's about, I mean, including the train tickets through, normally get some food and stuff when I'm there. I mean, for a pie and a drink and a bar of chocolate, it costs me like upwards of a tenner every time. Whereas if I go up to the local juniors, it's £6 entry, and then I can get a pie, a coffee, and a can of juice for like £3, and it's just so much better. You're closer to the pitch. Importantly, you can have a drink in the lower tiers in Scotland, which is something you can't do in the SPFL. But you're just so much closer to the players and the fans as well. It's so much more community focused, and I think that's something that football in Germany has really nailed. Is that even though a lot of the clubs are commercialized, even though there are still fan campaigns and there's a lot of fan contestation with their board members, but importantly, I think it's the foundations that football in Germany has laid that allow the fans to be able to do that. And I think it's something that all the football leagues at the moment should be looking to implement. Well, it's something that I'd look to implement. I know they won't. Don't get me wrong, I'm not naive, but I think it's a model that any football league should look to follow. I mean, we've been speaking for about an hour's time now, maybe a bit over actually. So we'll move towards wrapping things up. Christian, is there anything that you wanted to mention or bring up just before we finished up?
Nah, not really. It was fun to be thrown into this with 10 minutes on the clock.
Throwing me under the bus, Christian, as always. Thank you very much. Sitting having my dinner, and I was just like, "Oh, Christian would enjoy this."
But it's nice to know a guy.
Yeah, definitely. I'll remember not to ask you next time for your cheek. Callum, anything that you wanted to ask us? Anything that you wanted to bring up just before we finished up tonight?
I don't think so. Apart from just thanks for having me on. It was obviously it's great to make your debut on here and have a good chat about everything. You know, it was really nice to be able to do this, and it's a good help for the next step to improve the profile for my project going off, and just keep building that. And with my graduation from uni now, it's just helping for the next. This is the next step to keep going and try get way into this industry a little bit.
So what are the next steps for the project then, if you don't mind me asking?
It's just more about getting across to Germany, I believe, for myself, because that would be the absolute dream is to be able to get yourself into Germany and just be able to report more and whatnot. And I'm very aware it's so difficult, and the money wise, it'd be so tough to be able to do that from behind you, especially from 4 years of university. You're not the richest person in the world after that, I'll tell you.
Not,
So yeah, but I've done my sports journalism degree now. So I'll just continue help to build my project. Hopefully, try maybe bring to other platforms and just try find more time to bring more DDR football to everyone, and just shed a light more on it a bit more. That'll be hopefully the goal for it, and just see where it takes you.
Amazing. I love it, man. I love it. And I think it would be an absolute dream if you were able to go over to Germany more, maybe even plan to move over there at some point just to see what it was like to live for a couple of years. You're absolutely spot on though. Like coming out of uni, it's not easy. Especially with how the financial situations are at the moment. But I mean, best of luck to your project. Obviously, you're welcome back in this podcast anytime. If we have a club that's come up from the former East, we'll be sure to get in touch. Very much an expert in your field, and it's been great hearing all the different aspects and the different dynamics that are at play when we discuss the DDR and the former teams from there. And I've absolutely no doubt that we'll look to get you back on the show as well, because I'd quite like to do a deeper dive into, like football in East Germany, and instead of looking at it through the lens of a club like Wacker for Berlin or someone else, I'd quite like to just do a complete kind of look at it to find out why there's such a why there's such a massive gap between clubs from the former East and the former West. I think it'll be a really interesting episode. But I think that'll do us for tonight. Thank you both very much for joining me in tonight's episode. Christian, it was great to speak with you again. Callum, it was fantastic to have you on. I've absolutely no doubt that we'll have you on again in the future. To our listeners, once again, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If there's something that you want us to cover, a topic on football history or heritage, then you can get in touch with us on X. That's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk, and that can be anything related to football history, heritage, culture, identity, community, place, lost clubs, former grounds, player histories, you name it. As long as we can link it back to football history and heritage, we'll talk about it. So please get in touch, and even if you just want to have a chat with us about football and history, we're more than happy to do that with you as well. But for now, Christian, say goodbye.
Bye.
Callum, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
And we'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.